April 14, 1945. The West Wing, 7:47 a.m., Harold Ickes stood outside the entrance where he'd walked freely for 12 years. Briefcase in hand, watching a young military aide check his credentials twice. The clearance that had opened every door in Washington no longer worked. Inside, a voice he barely recognized was giving orders. The president's voice, but not Roosevelt's. Before we go further into this moment that changed American power forever, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, whether it's New York, London, Tokyo, or somewhere in between. It helps us keep bringing you these untold stories of history's most pivotal moments, and we love hearing from you. Now, let's step back into that silent hallway. Ickes had served Roosevelt since 1933, 13 years, longer than most marriages. He'd built dams, fought oil barons, championed civil rights, and become the old curmudgeon of the New Deal title he wore with pride. He knew every secretary's name, every corridor shortcut, every hidden exit. But this morning, he was told to wait. For the first time in over a decade, Harold Ickes realized he was no longer indispensable. And in that moment, standing outside the door he'd walked through 1,000 times, he understood something else too. Roosevelt's government had died with Roosevelt, and Truman was already building something new. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt collapsed on April 12, 1945, in Warm Springs, Georgia, the news didn't just stun a nation, it paralyzed a system. For 12 years and 39 days, Roosevelt had been the only president most Americans could remember. He'd guided the country through the Great Depression, mobilized it for total war, and reshaped the federal government into a machine unlike anything the founders had imagined. His cabinet wasn't just a collection of department heads. It was a constellation of power, loyalty, and personality orbiting a single man. Henry Morgenthau Jr. at Treasury wasn't just managing money, he was Roosevelt's confidant. Dining with him privately, shaping economic philosophy over cocktails. Henry Stimson at War wasn't just overseeing military operations, he was safeguarding the Manhattan Project. A secret so deep that even Vice President Truman hadn't been told. Harold Ickes at Interior controlled, more than national parks, he wielded influence over infrastructure, resources, and civil rights debates that reached into every state. These weren't bureaucrats. They were extensions of Roosevelt himself. Roosevelt had governed through controlled chaos. He encouraged rivalry. He kept advisors competing, overlapping, never giving anyone the full picture. Cabinet meetings were theatrical, full of debate, drama, and decisions that often happened afterward in private. Real power moved through handwritten notes, late-night phone calls, and personal loyalty. It was a system built for one man's genius, and it required that man to function. When Harry S. Truman took the oath of office at 7:09 p.m. on April 12th, he inherited not just an office, but an empire he didn't understand, and a court that didn't trust him. Truman had been vice president for 82 days. He'd met privately with Roosevelt twice. He didn't know about the atomic bomb. He hadn't been briefed on Yalta. He had no relationship with Churchill or Stalin. Most of Roosevelt's cabinet had never worked with him. Some had barely spoken to him. To them, Truman was an accidental compromise pick from Missouri, a former haberdasher, a senator who'd made his name investigating war contracts but never commanded global strategy. They expected him to defer. To carry on, to govern as Roosevelt's ghost, Truman had other plans. Within hours, he was already moving. Not with speeches or proclamations, but with something quieter and more surgical appointments. His old Senate Chief of Staff, Matthew Connolly, began taking calls in the anteroom. Former advisors who'd worked with Truman in Congress suddenly had access. Roosevelt's gatekeepers found themselves bypassed. The tone shifted. Meetings became shorter. Decisions came faster. There was no drama, no competition, just clarity. And for men like I.X. Morgenthau and Stimson, the message was unmistakable. The rules had changed. On April 16th, Truman held his first full cabinet meeting. The room was heavy with grief and uncertainty. These men, veterans of the New Deal, architects of wartime mobilization, waited for direction. Some expected Truman to ask for their guidance, to lean on their experience. Instead, Truman made a statement. Short, direct. He told them he intended to carry forward Roosevelt's policies, but that he would need their full cooperation and loyalty, not to a memory, to him. It was a line designed to sound reassuring, but every man in that room understood its real meaning. Truman wasn't asking, he was claiming. Behind closed doors, Truman's aides were already conducting quiet assessments. Who could he work with? Who couldn't? Who was competent? Who was loyal only to Roosevelt's ghost? Truman valued order, accountability, clear chains of command, everything Roosevelt's system had deliberately avoided. He wanted a government that served the office of the presidency, not the personality of one man. And that meant dismantling the structure Roosevelt had built, piece by piece, carefully, and without mercy. The myth that Roosevelt's cabinet would simply continue under Truman was widespread. Newspapers editorialized that the team must remain intact for continuity. Allies abroad expected the same voices on the other end of the line, but Truman saw what others didn't. He saw a government built entirely around personal relationships. He saw department heads who operated like feudal lords, answerable to no one but a man who was gone. He saw a system that couldn't function without Roosevelt because it had never been designed to, and he knew that if he didn't act, he would spend his entire presidency as a caretaker, presiding over a government he couldn't control. So he started taking it apart. Not with announcements, not with purges, but with exits, resignations, retirements, strategic replacements. One by one, Roosevelt's inner circle began to disappear. The first to go was Henry Morgenthau, Jr. He had been Treasury Secretary since 1934, 11 years of unbroken influence. He and Roosevelt had been neighbors in upstate New York, friends before politics. Morgenthau had shaped wartime finance, directed bond drives, and controlled the economic levers of a nation at war. But more than that, he had championed a controversial vision for post-war Germany. The Morgenthau Plan called for the complete deindustrialization of Germany, stripping it of factories, mines, and heavy industry, reducing it to an agricultural society incapable of waging war again. Roosevelt had tentatively approved it at the Quebec Conference in 1944, largely to avoid conflict with his friend. Truman read the plan in May 1945 and was horrified. He saw it not as justice, but as catastrophe. A ruined Germany would breed resentment, starvation, and chaos, exactly the conditions that had birthed Nazism in the first place. Worse, it would create a power vacuum in Central Europe that the Soviet Union could easily fill. Truman wanted stability, not revenge. He wanted Germany rebuilt as a buffer, not demolished as a warning. When he rejected the Morgenthau Plan, he wasn't just overruling a policy. He was rejecting an entire philosophy and the man who embodied it. Morgenthau tried to push back. He wrote memos. He requested meetings. But Truman's doors, unlike Roosevelt's, didn't open on request. Access had to be earned. By July 1945, it was clear Morgenthau no longer had it. On July 5th, he submitted his resignation. The letter was formal, polite, and devastated. In his private diary, Morgenthau wrote bitterly that the spirit of the New Deal had died with Roosevelt. But Truman didn't flinch. He replaced Morgenthau with Fred Vinson, a Kentucky judge with no grand visions but deep administrative competence. The Treasury Department shifted from ideology to management, from moral crusades to institutional process. It was a template Truman would follow again and again. Next came Harold Ickes, the old curmudgeon, the progressive firebrand, the man who'd fought oil companies, segregationists, and fellow cabinet members with equal fury. Ickes had built the Public Works Administration, managed war resources, and become a symbol of New Deal righteousness. But by 1946, he was increasingly isolated. Truman found him stubborn, combative, and unwilling to accept the new order. The breaking point came in February over a minor appointment, Poley, an oil executive Truman wanted as Undersecretary of the Navy. Ickes opposed it publicly, accusing Poley of corruption. Truman stood by his nominee. On February 13, 1946, Ickes resigned in spectacular fashion. His letter was 2,000 words long, a blistering indictment of what he called Truman's betrayal of principle. He accused the president of compromising with special interests, of abandoning Roosevelt's ethical standards, of lacking the moral compass necessary for high office. The press ran it on the front page. Columnists debated it for days. Some called Ickes a martyr. Others called him a relic. Truman called him nothing. He simply accepted the resignation and moved on. No counteroffer, no public response, just silence. And with that silence, the last of Roosevelt's true believers walked out. Henry Stimson, Secretary of War, left more quietly. At 78, he was the oldest cabinet member and one of the most respected. He had served under 4 presidents, overseen the mobilization of 8 million troops, and managed the most classified program in American history, the atomic bomb. But by the summer of 1945, Stimson was exhausted. The war was ending. His purpose was fulfilled, and he could sense that Truman wanted something different. Not a wartime elder statesman, but a peacetime administrator. On September 21, 1945, Stimson resigned, citing his health. It was gracious, dignified, and final. Truman thanked him warmly, awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal, and immediately began restructuring the War Department. Within 2 years, Truman would dissolve it entirely, merging it into the new Department of Defense under the National Security Act of 1947. Stimson's resignation wasn't just the end of a career. It was the end of an era, the end of Roosevelt's wartime cabinet, and the beginning of Truman's Cold War government. One by one, the others followed. Francis Biddle at Justice gone by June 1945, Claude Wickard at Agriculture, replaced by year's end. Jesse Jones at Commerce, forced out even before Roosevelt's death. By April 1946, fewer than half of Roosevelt's original cabinet remained, and those who stayed did so on Truman's terms. The numbers told the story. In 12 months, Truman replaced over 50% of Roosevelt's cabinet. Not through dramatic firings, but through calculated exits. He didn't humiliate them. He simply made it clear their time had passed, and in their place, he installed people he trusted, men who valued process over personality, loyalty over legacy, competence over charisma. Dean Acheson would shape Cold War diplomacy. George Marshall would rebuild Europe. Clark Clifford would architect national security doctrine. These weren't Roosevelt's men. They were Truman's builders, and they constructed the architecture of American power for the next half-century. But the transformation wasn't just about people. It was about systems. Truman issued executive orders, dozens of them that quietly rewired the executive branch. He clarified reporting lines. He ended overlapping authorities. He shut down Roosevelt's Office of Strategic Services and redistributed its functions, laying groundwork for the CIA. He elevated the State Department, which Roosevelt had often sidelined in favor of personal envoys. He redefined how the White House operated: shorter meetings, clearer agendas, documented decisions. Where Roosevelt had thrived on ambiguity and competition, Truman demanded structure and accountability. Cabinet meetings changed entirely. Under Roosevelt, they had been performances-long, meandering discussions full of interruptions, debates, and Roosevelt's storytelling. Under Truman, they became briefings. 30 minutes. Agenda distributed in advance. Notes taken, decisions recorded. It wasn't inspirational. It wasn't dramatic, but it worked. One aide said it plainly. Under Roosevelt, the cabinet was a stage. Under Truman, it was a boardroom. The shift was more than stylistic. It was philosophical. Roosevelt had governed as a commander, charismatic, intuitive, willing to bend rules and blur lines to get results. Truman governed as an administrator, methodical, disciplined, insistent that institutions outlast individuals. He didn't see himself as Roosevelt's successor. He saw himself as the presidency's custodian, and that meant ensuring the office could function even after he was gone, not dependent on genius or personality, but structured, resilient, and accountable. By 1947, the transformation was complete. Not a single Roosevelt-era cabinet member with real power remained. The New Deal coalition hadn't been dismantled. Social Security, labor protections, and federal infrastructure survived. But the people who'd built them were gone. The system had been professionalized. The court had become a bureaucracy. And Truman, the man many had dismissed as an accidental president, had seized full control. Historians often frame this transition as cold or ruthless, but Truman saw it differently. He believed Roosevelt's greatest achievement wasn't the New Deal or winning the war, it was proving that American democracy could survive crisis without becoming dictatorship. And the only way to honor that legacy, Truman believed, was to ensure the presidency didn't depend on one man's brilliance. It had to be an institution, structured, transferable, resilient. So he dismantled Roosevelt's empire, not out of disrespect, but out of conviction, because empires, no matter how benevolent, don't survive their emperors. Institutions do. The cabinet Truman built would guide America through the Berlin airlift, the founding of NATO, the Korean War, and the dawn of the nuclear age. It would manage the Marshall Plan, contain Soviet expansion, and establish the framework for American global leadership. None of that would have been possible with Roosevelt's team still in place, not because they were incompetent, but because they were incompatible with the world Truman inherited. Roosevelt had built a government to win a war. Truman had to build one that could manage a peace and prepare for the battles that hadn't yet begun. By the time Truman left office in 1953, the presidency had changed forever. It was larger, more structured, and more powerful than Roosevelt had left it. But it was also more accountable, bound not to personality, but to process. Future presidents would inherit a West Wing that functioned as an institution, not a court. They would govern through systems Roosevelt never needed, and Truman insisted upon. The modern presidency, with its National Security Council, its centralized chain of command, its bureaucratic depth, was born, not in Roosevelt's New Deal, but in Truman's quiet revolution. And it all started in that hallway. April 14, 1945. Harold Ives, standing outside the door, realizing his clearance no longer worked. That moment wasn't just about one man losing access. It was about an entire system being reset. Roosevelt's government had been brilliant, but it had been personal. Truman's would be institutional. Roosevelt had ruled through relationships. Truman would govern through roles. And in making that shift, Truman didn't betray Roosevelt's legacy. He preserved it, because he understood something Roosevelt's cabinet never could. The greatest leaders don't build monuments to themselves. They build systems that outlast them. Truman didn't inherit Roosevelt's cabinet. He replaced it, and in doing so, he transformed the American presidency from a personal office into an enduring institution, one that could survive the loss of even its most indispensable man.